Yes. Welcome back to Capital Consumption Theory. I'm here with Brian Winters and Austin Mackel, and today we are going to talk about currency. So, on last week's episode, Brian up a question that was originally from Jake Snyder about about private money versus Fed money. And I thought that was a really interesting topic. And, I realized there's a lot more to say about that. So this episode will be about currency. And after the episode, hopefully that will help me organize the chapter in my upcoming book on capital consumption theory and organize the chapter on currency assets and Bitcoin.
Can you just define the terms here? When you say currency, are you talking about actual physical currency or versus money in general? What do you mean by currency?
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. So, we can start from the concept of the broad money supply, and the broad money supply, which economists talk about, generally is made up of and refers to bank accounts in the economy. So if you go around and add up how much money everybody has in their bank accounts, then that is the broad money supply. So to start off with, you have to ask, what are these bank accounts? What are these what are these bank accounts, and also how do they relate to the physical money, the banknotes that everybody is familiar with, the green if you're in the US. So when you take $100 bill and you go to the bank and you put it in the bank, your bank deposit goes up by $100. But if you think about it, the bank is, the way the system is set up, the bank is not going to hold on to that $100 for you. They don't, put it in a safe deposit box and hold on to it until you need it. They will actually go and lend that money out to somebody else. So it may, go to somebody else's, mortgage to pay for somebody else's house. When they take a mortgage out from the bank and borrow money from the bank. So the bank is going to lend the money out. So the deposit, the bank account that you have, it's actually a liability. It is basically an IOU. It is a ledger at the bank that says the bank now owes you $100, right? It's a liability. So it is actually, strictly speaking, bank account is it is a promise of money. It's an IOU. It's not actually money.
So all right. So you want to talk about currency, and by currency you mean the physical currency that is in circulation plus all of the money that is in bank accounts in the United States. Is that what we're talking about when we say currency tonight?
Right. So I'll actually get us to a short definition at the very end, but I want to go over sort of the whole system and how it works and how to think about it before we get there. So that will be the conclusion. But to start off with, we got to start at the beginning. And I'll make the statement that really the economy runs on trust. So we're gonna do this whole thing. So if you ask, let's see. So let's go on to a thought experiment here. So one of the ideas that floats around is that banks create banks create money. That banks create money. And this is like sort of true, but sort of also not true at the same time. So a bank, so a bank is able to create bank deposits. So they're able to create a liability in their own name. And so one of the examples that comes from MMT is that if the bank decides to say lend you $10,000, it doesn't actually have to come up with the money from anywhere. It can actually just open an account for you and just write down in the account, Brian Winters has $10,000 in this account. And at the same time, they'll sign a loan agreement with you where, you're going to pay that $10,000 back to them over time. But the $10,000 that they put into your account, they absolutely issued that out of nothing. So that's a very special.
And so Robert Hockett in his book, Money from Nothing, goes into more detail about this, where they set up a bank and the process of signing a promissory note as the authority to create the money. So
Robert Hockett is good stuff. That's very similar. I incorporate that. He's got the right idea. And so the bank has this ability to just say, basically, by putting that $10,000 in that account, that I, the bank, owe you, Brian Winters, $10,000. The interesting thing about that is that is not actually a special property of banks. That is actually something that anybody can do. I, Eddie Chu, I could say, I owe you $1,000, Brian Winters, because I just really like you today.
I'm making all kinds of money tonight. This is good. We should do more episodes like this.
Exactly. So, and to the degree that I keep my word about it, then you're now sort of $1,000 richer. Ray Dalio uses an example where, you have a barkeeper, and you walk into the bar, and the barkeeper knows you. It's a local place. You live in a small town. He knows you, and you go in, you buy a beer, and you say, hey, put it on my tab. So he opens up his notebook and says, Brian Winter owes me, $10 for a beer. And you get your beer, spending occurs, and there's sort of no money involved in the transaction. There's a creation of debt there. There's a creation of $10 worth of debt, which enables $10 of spending. And there's actually no money, in the transaction at that present moment. So this liability creation thing is something that anybody can do. Businesses, they sort of do this all the time. Like when businesses are, transacting with each other, a lot of times, they don't ask for cash up front. They will issue a bill. They'll do invoicing for 90 days. So, if you and I are businesses, you'll buy, $1 million of services from me. I'll just write an invoice. And at the same time, in my balance sheet, I will write down that I just got $1 million richer because, Brian's business owes me $1 million. So that, again, that is debt creation. And that is a power that you have. So long as I trust you to make good on that debt, you can just, out of nowhere, based on nothing, you can just say, look, I owe you $1 million, but, I'll pay you back in the future. If it's a business, it's probably 90 days. But that, again, that is debt issuance.
It's not really, it's not
people can do that,
though, right? Like when the business has presumably got $1 million worth of goods or services in exchange for $1 million on their ledger.
Well, no, I gave. Let's see, I forgot. I think I was the seller, right? No, you were the seller. Was I the seller? So if I'm selling to you $1 million of services, so you get $1 million in services, but I actually put on my balance sheet that I got $1 million richer because I issued an invoice. I wrote an invoice, and Brian Winters signed it, and Brian Winters agrees that he owes me $1 million. So because based on Brian Winters owing me, or Brian Winters LLC owing me, I have $1 million assets, on my balance sheet, and it's debt. It did not require money. Does that make sense?
Yeah, except you got something for it, right? And so if I provided $1 million worth of bricks,
Yeah.
I mean, money was spent on those.
Right.
Yeah,
I got something for it.
I see where you're coming from.
Here's the point that I'm making. People think of the economy running on money, that, we have this money that we trade back and forth. You could imagine, and theoretically it's possible, you could even potentially do it. You could have an economy that runs entirely on debt. And that's a little bit what Robert Harkett talks about. So if you, me, and Austin, the three of us have businesses, and we're sort of trading with each other, and we all have trade with each other. On a monetary system, like maybe there's tokens, maybe it's like gold or Bitcoin or something that we trade back and forth, sort of counter current to the flow of goods and services, and that keeps track of everything. But there's another way to do it, where we can just issue, like we can just write it down and keep records and issue these invoices to each other. So every time I get a good or service from you, I just write down, and you write down, Brian Winters owes me money, and then the same thing with Austin and Brian, and the same thing with me and Austin, that there's just, and then we trade back and forth. Like sometimes you're buying stuff from me, sometimes I'm buying stuff from you. So maybe like this month, you bought $1 million worth of goods from me. Next month, I might need $1 million worth of whatever you're making. And in that case, I might just say, we could just cancel that $1 million debt. Like originally you owed me $1 million, but now that, you've bought, but now you're selling something to me for $1 million, I need to pay you, and I can pay you just by canceling out that debt.
May I jump in? My uncle used to be in something called the ecosystem, which is, from like the 60s or 70s or something. It's an old fashioned hippie thing that basically worked like that. You would like, it's a bunch of people who are like on small farms and stuff. And you would go and fix someone's roof, and you would get like these echo points, which then you could use to pay somebody else to do. So it was sort of like, it was like you had credit with the whole group. Once you did something for one member of the group, the whole group owed you, which is what we try and do, which is what money's kind of doing.
Sort of like,
and David Graeber would probably have said something like, well, this is actually what existed in a lot of places before money, right? So he uses the example, I think, of English villages that would count in silver pieces, but there wouldn't be any silver pieces in the village, right? Like, so they would, or there'd be very few, and they'd get together at the end of the week, and they go, well, I gave you 5 eggs, and you gave Susan, a goat, or whatever the village economy was, and how much everybody owes everybody. It would all sort of get computed at once at the end of the week, and see who was still owed and who wasn't. And that would give them sort of credit going into the next week. I'm, remembering what David Graeber verbally described in a lecture here, so it's not like it's a very accurate picture, but there's a lot of people who would actually practice things like that, small societies and networks that actually try and do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the insight here is that debt and money are similar in that they're both able to enable spending, but they're different in that money is never canceled or paid back. Money or assets, money has like an asset owner, but no debtor. So for example, if we're using like gold money, and the gold, a certain amount of gold belongs to Brian, then Brian just owns that gold, so he has that value in his account. It's owned by Brian. It belongs to Brian, and that's different from a liability. So or a liability, which is also an asset. So an asset liability, a debt type of thing, is where what Brian owns is the liability of Eddie Chu. So it's not, the gold itself sort of stored value, but with the debt, the value is sort of guaranteed by the debtor. So that $1 million note, that IOU that Brian owns in that case, that depends on me, promising that in the future that I'll pay that $1 million to him. So to move forward, the next question is, what about the Federal Reserve? What about the Federal Reserve? So these bank accounts, they are, the banks, in order to make sure that they always have enough money to give to people when people want to take money out of their account, they have accounts at the Federal Reserve. So the base money, the bank's money is kept at the Federal Reserve, and the same way that the bank has a liability to Brian Winters, the account owner, based on the value of his account, the Fed has that same relationship with the banks, where the banks will have, like, say, $100 million or $100 billion at the Fed, and the Fed, has, in their account book, they will record a liability. Chase Bank has, $100 billion at the Fed. The Fed sort of like owes Chase Bank $100 billion. So to understand what this means, we can take a look at how it came into being. And so, originally under the gold standard, the base money used to be gold, gold bullion and gold coins. And the banks would keep gold, for their deposits, but sometimes they would need more. So they also had a central bank where, like if they had more gold than they wanted to keep in their branch, they would, send it over to the Federal Reserve branch, and the Federal Reserve would keep that gold for the banks, and the banks would have an account with the Federal Reserve. So it used to be that ultimately everything is a promise of gold, that, under the gold standard, those liabilities of the Federal Reserve to the banks would be payable in gold. And so whenever the bank said, called the Federal Reserve up and said, I need to get some gold out of my account with you, then the Federal Reserve would arrange a shipment of gold to the bank. So the liability of the Federal Reserve originally was a liability, in gold. Like they owe the bank, a certain amount of gold.
All right, so where are we at here as far as currency? Currency is, how are we figuring out, getting back to the point of how much is bank money and how much is, central bank?
Well, we'll get there. We'll get there, but it is a long ride. So Perry Merling's money view is very good, and the way he would describe it is that originally gold was the base money of the economy, and everything else, including the Federal Reserve liabilities, including the bank liabilities, those are all promises of gold. We got off the gold standard, and we got off it completely in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, Nixon made American Federal Reserve liabilities, the US dollar, no longer exchangeable for gold. So prior to 1970s, other central banks could come to the central bank and said, I've got all these dollars that I got from trade. I want the gold that they represent. After 1970, we've cut that off, and the dollar is no longer a promise of gold. That promise has been canceled. But the economy continues to run. And so what happens, as Per Merling would describe, is that you've now replaced gold as the base money in the economy with the Federal Reserve liability. So the point I would like to make is that we continue to call Federal Reserve liabilities, we still call them liabilities, but they are a very special type of liability. They are not actually really a liability, because liability means that you owe someone something. Like if I have a liability with Brian Winters, then that means that, you know, I owe Brian Winters. At some point in the future, Brian Winters can come to me and get payment in some other form, such as the US dollar, for that liability. But the Federal Reserve has a special place in the economy where their liabilities are not payable. Some people describe them as I owe you nothings. So now that we've, post Nixon, you can no longer take a Federal Reserve liability, a US dollar, and go to the Federal Reserve, and there's nothing that they'll give you. Like they don't, you have your dollar, but they don't owe you anything for the dollar. So it's actually a liability in name only, but it is not, it's not actually debt, because it's not actually something that can be considered to be paid back. It simply just exists. It's taken the place of gold, basically. So,
Can I jump in there? Can I jump in there and be a little bit problematic? So the idea is that if gold was the base money, that would have more real value. But most of the value people have in gold is the assumption that other people also have it, will consider it valuable, and exchange it, for example, grain, lumber, actual other things that you need to live, right? And so gold, in a sense, isn't any different from that. Like I think I've called it before. It's it's like primitive cryptocurrency, gold, right? It's this thing we've agreed is a store of value because it has certain characteristics, but none of those characteristics will actually, spin an engine or feed a child or do anything in the real world, right? So it's kind of inert in a similar way that money is.
Right. So, right. So what you go to when with the evolution of the Federal Reserve liability into fiat money, is that you go from something which in the past it was an IOU, as in the Fed owes you, the bank, payment in terms of gold, and you end up with it morphing into something different. And it is no longer, the Fed no longer owes you anything, but in terms of money, what it basically means is that if you're the owner of a Federal Reserve liability, you are owed. You are owed, but you've taken, it used to be the Federal Reserve owes you. Now Federal Reserve is chopped off. They don't owe you anything. They don't owe you any gold, but you are owed and you are owed. And the way that you get payment for that being owed that is that you go into the marketplace and then you spend your dollar with somebody else. So you can convert that base money into anything in the economy, because everything in the economy is on sale for $4 or for promises of dollars. But you've chopped off the front end of it about the Fed being the one that owes you something. And so this is similar to what Austin, I think, was trying to say a little bit earlier, that money is, in a sense, it is different from debt. Debt is somebody owes you, but money has become generalized. It is society owes you something. And so, with the economic system, you go out and perform labor, or you provide a good and service to someone, and then you get money in your hands, and then that money represents a liability of society that you will be able to go back into the economy and exchange that for something that you want or need. You can look at also sort of how private banks worked during that gold standard era. And they would have bank accounts like you do today, and the bank accounts would represent like gold that the bank owes you. But they would also have they would also issue notes. They would also issue bank notes, and the bank notes said the same thing. They said that you are owed a certain amount of gold, but the bank notes are different in that they don't have your name on it. And so if you have an account at the bank, then it says, Brian Winters is owed $100 worth of gold from, Wells Fargo Bank. But the bank note that the bank might give you, it doesn't say Brian Winters bank note on it. It just says, bank note of Wells Fargo. The holder of the note, whoever that is owed $100. And so what would happen is that, because this paper note is more convenient than gold, is that people would be able to sort of pass these notes back and forth as money. And so it could be traded in the local economy and sort of move from hand to hand as people perform goods and services for each other, without ever coming back to the bank to be redeemed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Like a check that's already been endorsed, you could sign it over to somebody else. So
right, it sort of becomes money. Yeah.
Okay. And so how does that help us determine how much of the currency in circulation is, what was the original source of it?
So we'll definitely get there. But let me continue the story from where we are at the moment. So debt is sort of similar to money, but debt has the problem, which Minsky talks a little bit about it. It has a problem that stems from that issue that at some point in the future, the debt is going to be paid back, right? And so, you can build up debt in society. And Jeff Crocker talks about, the use of debt, substituting for money. And Ray Dalio talks about that in society. And it increases instability a little bit, because every now and then you have a sort of crisis of faith, and people start worrying about whether they're actually going to be paid for that debt or not. And so when they do that, they may want their money back for the debt, or sometimes, a lot of times, they will sort of stop being willing to roll over debt. So lots of businesses in the economy, they have lots of debt, but they can live off of just paying the interest payments because they continue to roll it over. So they pay back the old debt, but then they issue new debt at the same time. So they're able to kind of keep that going. But then every now and then it builds up too much, and then people get worried at the same time. And when businesses go to roll over that debt, then suddenly the lenders are like worried about, they're not willing to roll it. And so if they don't roll it, then what you have is that, you had previously economy that was running on debt, but now the debt suddenly like shrinks because everybody's issuing debt or
it doesn't have to
accepting
come
debt.
from the bank. It doesn't have to come from the bank.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's no one who wants to borrow, right? Like, because there's always going to be somebody who wants to go into debt, right? And you after a while, you've saturated the market for debt.
Yeah,
everybody's already got, 2 mortgages, and then everyone who can afford it is in the property market and leveraged to the hilt, and everybody who can, you know what I mean? Like, there's no one left.
Right. That's true.
who would borrow.
Yeah,
the only people who are left
are like, because the borrowers start saying, gosh, I'm pretty leveraged. If my income goes down, I'm gonna go, the debt is gonna is going to kill me. So I better pay it down. And then when they pay it down, then the debt disappears.
Yeah. And
So
this is where Steve Keen. This is where Steve Keen is really good and deserves a shout out, because he's really good at showing how when there's a net decrease in debt, the whole economy sort of necessarily contracts, and how change in debt sort of tracks with unemployment and all of the role of the toxic role of private debt in our economy. You know, he loves Minsky, and he loves the expression, I think, the fundamental instability of capitalism is upwards. And like, we're definitely seeing that now at the moment with house prices in Australia and other things. It's just like, you know, this runaway debt bubble that, like, it can't end well.
Right. So another way that, you know, potential instability, another part of that is that, again, we're you know, in our economy, we call bank liabilities money. So we're running everything on bank liabilities, and that could potentially, the instability that you could get there is the instability that you saw during the Great Depression with bank runs, where everybody who was owed money, who had accounts at the bank, said, you know, I'm worried about my account there, so I'm going to go pull it out, thereby destroying that you know, liability that the bank had. You know, everybody's trying to take their money out, and the whole, it doesn't work. The whole system collapses in that sense. So in normal times, this does not happen because that bank liability, it's generally pretty stable. Like, you know, every now and then Brian Winters will go to the bank, and he'll say, I need the money out, I need to pay for something. So he takes the $100 out, gives it to Austin, and then what does Austin do? You know, having performed a service for Brian, he takes that $100 and he sends it right back to the bank. And so you always end up with sort of this stability where people are taking money out of the bank, they're getting paid back money that the bank owes them, but at the same time, somebody else is going to take that money and lend it right back to the bank. And so it's stable in normal times. In a bank run situation, it's non-stable. But then after the Great Depression, then you set up the FDIC, which, you know, insures all of those accounts. And so, you know, today that is, you know, probably more or less no longer an issue, because
the only thing would be the equivalent of that today would be a shortage of physical banknotes if everyone's running to the ATM and pulling out cash and the ATM's empty. And what would happen in that case, I'm pretty sure, is that most governments say, okay, well, we'll just print more money and put it in the ATMs, right? Like, everyone still has the same amount, like your account, you can empty your account if you want, right? And that would restore confidence, et cetera, et cetera. But I feel like the issue of the bank run is less. I mean, I did have a friend of mine ask me at the start of the 2020 of the coronavirus thing, should I get my money out of the bank? Should I pull out? Did I think he should pull out all his cash, right, and stuff it in his mattress before there was a run? But I kind of feel like that problem probably has been solved. But the other thing that you mentioned that when someone takes money out of the bank, pays someone, they put it in the bank. Normally, it's just a straight transfer from one account to another now, right? But the other thing is, when banks create a loan, they also create an account. So when they create a loan, they write two numbers down. They write down a debt and a credit next to your name, and then one of them grows faster than the other. And that's the primary way that the money supply grows for the economy. And but in a sense, right, this is my big thing, is that, like, well, the banks always have to run a profit, so they've always got to take out more than they put in, which is why the government always has to run a deficit at a minimum to sort of match that flow out of money out of the real economy that the financial sector creates, and probably tax the financial sector so that, you know, the amount of liquidity in the financial sector doesn't just build up to a ridiculous amount.
Right. So the bank liabilities, the point I'm making is that bank liabilities, strictly speaking, they're actually liabilities. They're actually not money. You know, this is a CCT view. It actually differs from mainstream economists. Mainstream economists will call it money, but there is some similarity to money in the bank liability, in terms of that, like, on a net basis, when you net on an aggregate basis, when you net out what everybody in the economy is doing, it is a liability that never has to be paid. So, you know, if it has to be paid in the future, then it's debt. If it never has to be paid, if it never has to be paid off and disappear, then it's not debt, it's money. So bank liabilities are a little bit similar to money, but strictly speaking, they are a debt, because it is the bank individually who owes you that money. And so they lack the second money characteristic, which a Federal Reserve liability has, which is that they are attached to a debtor, the debtor being the bank. The bank owes that money. Whereas, while we say that a Federal Reserve liability is a liability of the Federal Reserve, they don't actually owe that money. They'll never be required to pay it back. The bank, they do pay back deposits, on an individual basis, but then on a net basis, economy wide, they don't have to pay stuff back because it gets loaned to them again. Go ahead, Brian.
So Austin said something a minute ago about how most of the money in the economy was the result of interest that had been paid. Is that
no? Most of the money in the economy, but what he's saying is not actually money. It's right. It's something else. It's a loan is the money that's created for the principal of the loan, right? So the banks are always creating the principal, and then they create the principal, and then you owe them that plus interest. But what the point of someone like Steve Kane is making is that your interest has to come out of someone else's principal. So there actually has to be a constant acceleration of debt in the economy. If you had an economy that was just built on banks with no role for government, you would just not need constant creation of new debt. You would need the constant creation of debt to accelerate. You would need it, and at the point at which it can't, which debt creation can't accelerate anymore, is when we have a crash like 2008. You think that was a pure financial crash where there just was, debt. There was more and more debt, and there was no way for the new loans that were being created to be sufficient to cover the interest payments on the old ones, and that's the sort of basic problem that drove the financial crisis, and is sort of an inherent risk in our banking system. That's me attempting to paraphrase Steve Kane, anyhow.
All right. So if we have a basic income that will drive up interest rates because you won't need to create as much money, and interest rates go up, doesn't that? I guess so. Doesn't this make it harder to cover all the interest payments when they're higher?
Let me answer that question.
The reason they're so low is because we can't cover higher payments, right? That's why interest rates have to be so low, because the economy cannot support paying a higher level of interest rates without collapsing, right? A basic income would mean the economy was stronger, and it could pay a higher level of interest rates, and probably would need to stop inflation at some point.
Well, okay. So at a lower interest rate, does that mean that you got to throw more money at it to keep it growing because it doesn't return as much? Is that?
No, it means you throw less money at it. If the interest rate is really low, you put a little bit of money in the economy, the market's going to respond with a bunch of businesses borrowing to try and meet that demand. Right? Like, okay, there's more people got money to spend. I'm going to go try and sell them more pies or beers. You borrow money to do that. And so you get more of a multiplier effect for what you spend. You have more of not a multiplier effect. I shouldn't use that term, but more of a flow-on effect, a ripple effect through the economy. And then when you want to slow down that ripple effect, you increase interest rates.
So I'm going to try to answer this briefly from the CCT view, and then try to move on back to currency. So I would point out that, and I think Austin was going there a little bit, that one of the things that interest rates connect back to is the returns on real investments. That at the very base, that's what it connects to. And so if you're running the economy as hot as it should be, then there's a lot of demand for the production of those productive investments. And so there's a lot of investment demand. Businesses saying, we need to build more factories to give everybody, everything that they need and deserve. And so that will actually drive up interest rates. That's a sign of a healthy economy. But I want to kind of get back to currency. And what if you think about the private banking example, one of the insights here is that buying and selling of debt is in some ways equivalent to borrowing and lending. So when I had that $100 bill which said that the bank owes me $100 worth of gold, and then I handed it to Brian Winters for payment of something, there's two views, there's two ways of looking at that. So one way of looking at that is that I sold something I sold that money to Brian. So I sold the $100 to Brian for a cow. So I gave him $100, $100 note. He gave me a cow. I'm selling something. So it looks like a token when you look at it like that. A different way of viewing it, which in this example is equally true, is that it is to look at it as debt, to look at as the bank owes me $100, right? And then Brian gave me a cow, so now I owe $100 to Brian, and I can so we just cancel out the two legs of that thing where the bank owes me $100, I owe Brian $100, so we just hand the banknote over. Now the bank just owes Brian $100, and I don't owe Brian anymore, and the bank also does not owe me anymore. So we just canceled out two legs to transfer that debt relationship to Brian. Back in middle school, we used to gamble small money on a card game called Big Two. And there might be 4 players, and what would happen is the player who won, they won by getting rid of all their cards, and then everybody else, based on how many cards they still had, would then have to pay the person who won. So maybe if I won, maybe Brian has three cards, so he owes me $3. Austin has 5 cards, so he owes me $5. Now, the canonical way to do this when you're gambling is that we have tokens. And so we pass the tokens back and forth. Brian will give me 2 tokens. Austin will give me 3 tokens. But we were in school, so we didn't have tokens. So we had to write it down on a piece of paper. And if you write it down, in the direct way and say, oh, Brian owes me $2. Austin owes me $3. Then it becomes really complicated, because if you have 4 players, then you have all these one-to-one relationships that you have to account for, everybody owing everybody else different amounts of stuff. But you can actually account for it by simply just recording for every player what they owe or what is owed to them. So you end up with either. So when I win, I just say, Brian owes me 3, Austin owes me 2. All I have to write down is under Eddie's name, Eddie gets a +5. And then Brian gets a -2, Austin gets a -3. And then in subsequent, times, rounds of the game, maybe Brian will win, maybe Austin will win. And we can actually completely ignore who it was that was supposed to pay the winner, as long as we just write down that the person who has to pay, they have to pay, but it doesn't matter that they have to pay Brian, the winner. It just matters that they have to pay. And then it also matters that Brian is supposed to be paid. So in that way, you can actually shift back and forth from a token economy to a liability economy. And it's the same thing, because the legs of the debt, they cancel out.
So it's like if you had a bunch of points and you can measure them all relative to each other, or you can measure them all relative to a central point, right? And then every one of them just gets a one-dimensional value, more or less.
Yeah.
which is the distance from that central point, rather than say, well, it's this distant from that point or that. You reduce that complex network to a series of single values.
Just a single value for every person. You can ignore the interrelationships. The point is that liabilities and tokens, they actually, there's some similarities there, and in some cases they can substitute for each other. So the way that CCT draw some, so I want to do some induction here, draw some kind of put this whole story together and draw some conclusions. So the way that CCT views debt, including bank money, bank liabilities, is that debt actually helps the economy to sort of increase money velocity. If you consider that only the base money of the economy, that is money, and everything else is debt, including the bank money. That's all debt. And what the debt does is it speeds up the velocity of the base money. So in the economy, I may have like $100, but I don't want to spend it at the very moment. So I'll take it to a bank, and then the bank plays middleman there, and they will send my money over to Austin, because Austin is buying a house or starting a business or whatever, and he wants to spend some money. So the $100, which is still sort of owned by me through the bank, manages to get into the hands of Austin, and it manages to generate spending in the economy that it would not generate if the bank was not there. So here's the thing about the money supply, because we're trying to get back to like, what does this really mean for the economy? And the thing about money supply is that on its own, it doesn't do anything on its own. What matters is not the money itself, but the flows of the money, the velocity of the money, those transfers of money back and forth. So if you imagine like, you could imagine like theoretically like a very large economy with a very small amount of money. And if we manage to just, transfer, remember, every time we transfer the money, we are doing a bit of production and spending. At the same time, like someone is spending and someone is producing. So we're doing some production and spending every time we transfer that money. So if we could manage to transfer that money like really quickly, like I buy something from Brian, and then Brian like right away buys something from Austin, Austin comes back to me, within the space of the year, the faster we move that money, the more spending it will enable, if that makes sense. It depends on velocity. So the famous equation is mv equals PQ. The money supply times the velocity of that money supply is equal to the price level times the production in the economy. And the production is the real stuff. That's the stuff that we care about. Assuming velocity is, economists, a lot of times they like to say, all else being equal, and then they draw some conclusions, which you can draw if all else is equal, but not necessarily if all else is not equal. That's the quantity theory of money. So that's where you say, oh, we're going to pretend the velocity, never changes, and then we're going to say if you have more money supply, then you'll get inflation, if production also doesn't change. There's a lot of possibly wrong conclusions that you can draw if you do it that way. So the right way to do it is not sort of this basic algebraic analysis. It's you have to look at it dynamically, and you have to look at the four variables: the money supply, the velocity of the supply, the price level, and the production, and see how the different things change at the same time. You have to do a dynamical analysis of it. For example, one of the conclusions of CCT is that If you put basic income into the economy, even if it's monetary, and the Fed creates it out of nothing, if it spurs more production, which it will based on low capacity utilization right now, then the price level doesn't change. You just get more money, and you also get more production from that money. Another CCT view is hyperinflation. Like, how does hyperinflation happen? And I have an article on Medium on that, but I'm not going to talk about that more today. Yeah. So, as to conclude, you have money and you have debt, and those are a little bit different. And the difference is that money is never paid back. It's never paid back, and money also is not attached to any particular person. Nobody is the debtor with money. Versus debt, you have those two things where it's got to be paid back, and there is a person who's the debtor who has promised to pay it back in the future. Anyone can create debt in their own name. So banks, businesses, corporations do it all the time. Every time they issue a corporate bond, they are borrowing money, or that they can issue. They're creating a liability in their own name, and they're selling it. So anybody can do that. And it's sort of a very basic feature of an economy. Unless you are going to outlaw anybody from ever lending to someone, or forever making a promise that I'll pay tomorrow, or anything like that, you can't really take that out of the economy. It's sort of a very basic thing that can be done and ends up being done in the economy.
What if you took interest out of the equation, though? And you can borrow, you can lend, but you can't charge interest. How would that impact things?
So that's sort of like a price. How do you say that? It's an artificial price limit, and what will happen is that if the artificial price limit is zero, but in actuality, the market, based on demand and supply, it would be like 3% or 5%. What happens is, if you're not allowed to charge interest, then the supply just goes away. Like, people will not lend their money, and you actually have that law, as I understand, in Islam. You have it in Christianity, actually, but it's sort of ignored. I think there's parts of the Bible where that, but that part of the Bible, it just kind of, we ignored it. I think there were times in Europe where there were usury laws where they said, you're not allowed to charge interest. Or
the Jewish population were forced to be the banking population,
exactly.
And then right, because or that would be one of the professions they were allowed to do. Sort of almost like people will be given, dirty jobs from a minority.
Right. Exactly. Banking was the dirty jobs that the Europeans shoved on the Jews.
Okay. And so if you were going to get rid of interest, can you address this problem by through sovereign money, through just creating new money directly instead of borrowing it into existence?
So I don't think that there is a really fundamental and workable way to get rid of interest. Interest arises, I would say, because there is capital accumulation, because you can do such a thing as invent or build after someone else has invented, like a factory, to say automate the manual task of weaving. And when you do that, you have to have money up front, and you have to spend that up front to build the thing. But after you've built it, then over time, every year that it continues to exist, and it may be very long lived, it might last for 50 years or more, it will every year give you a productivity benefit where, if you had 5 levers and they're working by hand, they have that much production. But with the automated machine, the production goes way up. So you have this value that the capital creates. And so as a result of that, that will naturally create a demand for capital. That will create a natural time value of money where, if I don't have money, but I know how to set up a factory, then naturally I will want to buy money on the market by paying with an interest rate over time. That's good for me. That's good for the lender. It's good for the economy. We should not. We should go completely.
Wait, didn't we say earlier that the debt was and the interest was what made capitalism spiral unstably upwards?
The problem is that the problem is consumers rely on that system to get their spending money too, right? Because indirectly through the labor market, right? The labor market is people getting jobs at these factories that have borrowed the money, and we're using the debt to pay back the debt as well, right?
Right.
Whereas if people had an income from the government, then it would work, and it would prevent the over reliance on debt which we have.
Yeah. So the CCT view is the CCT plus Minsky view is that the Minskyan instability happens because you're not sending enough money directly to the consumer. So as a result, you're not able to accumulate that capital. You're not able to accumulate that productivity, which if you had the productivity, that would be real income, which would allow you to actually pay the interest on that debt. But because that is, sort of bottlenecked there and cut off there, then the debt just, sort of just builds up, and, it's ineffectual, and it builds up and creates instability.
I mean, so as part of the problem, like if you want to build this factory, that you need a large quantity of money because you want like one person to own it. And so is this a problem that can be resolved through like worker co-ops, and everybody, instead of raising $100,000, you get 100 workers to each kick in 1,000.
Well, I don't really see it as a problem so much as it is a part of the landscape. Like it's almost like a law of physics that you can, like, even if you were on a desert island, but you like rationed your time and you said, I'm going to spend half my time on setting up like this elaborate system of nets, which are going to catch fish, even when I'm not, even when I'm not there, like it's a trap. And, every day, fish just get caught, and every day I have fish to eat. That the same logic still applies, where you can invest into capital accumulation, and that's a good thing. So that's not a problem. That is a good thing. We should be leaning into it, and we should be maximizing capital accumulation. But in order to maximize capital accumulation, you have to have consumers who are able to actually access that production. If only the top 1% have all the income and they can't use all of the production, then that is actually the situation we have today, where all of they're looking around for something to invest in, and they can't. And so what happens is that all the assets just get blown up. The interest rates go down, assets get blown up. And meanwhile, people are like starving in a world that has plenty of food and housing and clothing and healthcare, that you could take care of them, but you're not, because this is not well understood, in the general public and among economists. And so we're just doing this stupid thing of not having a basic income.
All right. Well, I feel like I learned something tonight.
Can I jump in and respond to a couple of things there really quickly? One example is, before the factories, one important example, of course, was shipping. So the Dutch and Venetian banking systems sort of evolved alongside these international shipping ports. And it's the same thing, you invest to build a ship or launch an expedition.
Yep.
And you need the money up front. And in terms of, can you do it work-around rather than the bank? You could. That's kind of what crowdfunding for certain products is kind of like that, right? We're saying that that's except it's coming from the customer, right? Like the customers are giving the producers credit rather than the bank, saying we'll pay up front and we'll get the product later. And then you get and you also have worker co-ops who could do it, but there's there's a whole other set of issues with worker co-ops. And their relationship with capital and profit and stuff like that, which complicates the picture a little bit.
One solution to get to utopia is where, not just the top 1%, but everybody has basic financial education and everybody invests and everybody own assets. But to get there, we have to have the basic income first. And then after the basic income, we should, put financial literacy into high schools and, mandate that everybody, learns about assets and how to, how to make assets work for you. And if you could do that successfully, then you'd have sort of a utopia, and you would not have a capital consumption imbalance.
I don't know if everyone trading stocks all day is my idea of utopia. I think we can do better than that.
Well, they don't.
If we're being utopian,
buy and hold.
Huh?
They could just buy and hold. They could all be Warren Buffett. They could all buy and hold. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah. I would like to see the stock market and privately owned businesses recede as part of society overall. Like less of society it being in the private sector and more stuff being sort of non-profit, cooperative or publicly owned, right? But I think that's a better way of approaching it than people on the left who want to sort of try and abolish capitalism, or people on the right who want to say, well, everything then therefore needs to be marketized and everything needs to be viewed through this lens of commodities and shares and so on.
Okay. Well, sounds like that might be a topic for another night.
All right, cool. Morning here. Anyhow, catch you guys around.
Very good. Thanks, guys. See everybody in 2 more weeks.
All right.